Powell told the president in a long meeting that if he went to war in Iraq, then we were going to neglect Afghanistan because we didn't have enough troops to do both. Subsequently, that's exactly what we did. And second, that he didn't have enough troops, even with that, to do Iraq and to do it with some degree of confidence in the aftermath. Rumsfeld was telling the commander, Tommy Frank, you can do it with 50,000 troops. This was Rumsfeld's his whole objective, was to prove that the revolution in military affairs had produced precision-guided munitions, an air force and other things that could do the things that 500,000 troops used to be required to do. Shock and awe, and you could finish and you could be out. And that was Rumsfeld's plan. So you weren't going to get the Secretary of Defense, Donald Rumsfeld, to go over to Congress and ask for an increase in the end strength of the land forces because it would defy what he was saying.
When an organization or a government wants to do something that's wrong, illegal, and there are checks and balances and there are oversight that they have to deal with, there are three kinds of actors. There are the heavies who are going to do what they want to do and they'll do anything they must to get their way. Then there are the yes men and the yes women who go along with it. And then there are the people with a certain morality, a certain integrity. And those people might receive false information, they might receive threats, intimidation, in order to make them go along. I have a theory about which one you are, but why don't you tell me?
I'm a slow learner, and I've faulted myself for this all my life. When I do learn, I learn well, and I can then practice fairly well. But I'm a slow learner, and it took me a while before I began to realize what was happening to the George W. Bush administration. It took Powell a while to figure it out too. And in that sense, I'm guilty of not being able to ascertain exactly what was going on around me and to either resign or fight back as hard as I could and probably suffer something worse than resignation.
They lied. They said there were weapons of mass destruction. There were none, and they knew there were none.
There are many Americans voting for the first time this year who were children when the Twin Towers fell and when we invaded Iraq. What would you want a responsible citizen to know about the run-up to the Iraq War, your role, Colin Powell's role, and the way that intelligence was being used?
Let me answer your question by asserting something that you might not be thinking about, but that nonetheless has been incredibly insightful for me. Not only do I speak now from a point of experience within the councils of government, but also from a point where I've had more than 400 students on 2 campuses do case studies that each one has enlightened me even more. So I don't have quite the same view I did in 2003, 2004 as I do now because of some really exhaustive research into documents, actions, transcripts, and so forth that I was not privy to at the time. So you had this set of circumstances that led to a march to war that was buttressed by, I suspected it when we were doing it, I know it now, the intelligence was cherry-picked, and it was cherry-picked by the Vice President and by the Office of Special Plans in the Defense Department to fit, as the Downing Street memo said, the objective that Cheney wanted to pursue and that he convinced the President he should pursue, and that was invading Iraq. And that was a false story to the American people, and I'll give you the most incredible ingredient in that story. The most powerful moment of Powell's presentation with polling internationally and nationally was when he inferred a connection between Saddam Hussein and 9/11. And how did he do that? By saying there were substantial contacts between Saddam Hussein and his Mukhabarat, intelligence service, secret service, and Al-Qaeda. Well, how did that come about that Powell said that? Very interesting. We were in the National Intelligence Council spaces, and I knew he was angry. He came down the hall and he grabbed me, he literally grabbed me, and he pushed me into one of the rooms that was empty, and he slammed the door. And he sat me down at the table. He'd never treated me this way before in some 12 years of our acquaintance. And he said, I am so sick and tired of this bullshit about terrorism and contacts with Saddam Hussein and so forth. It won't stand up. It stinks. I think he thought I was going to defend it. I looked at him and I said, boss, I'm with you. Let's rip it out. Good, he said, and he stood up and went back into the conference room and resumed the rehearsal that we were doing. I told the speechwriter, the person who was sitting at the computer, you know, was this going to be a tough task, but we're going to extricate everything that's in there. John McLaughlin, Georgia Tennis deputy, heard me, was standing right there. Within an hour, Tennant leaves. He comes back in a few minutes later and he lays a bombshell on the table, almost breathlessly. He says, we have just gotten the results of the interrogation of a high-level al-Qaeda operative. And he has revealed, under interrogation, substantial contacts between the Mukhabarat and al-Qaeda to include, and this is almost a direct quote, training them in how to use chemical and biological weapons. Powell turned to me and said, put it back in. Polling shows the most powerful thing, and you got Americans today still believe Saddam Hussein had something to do with 9/11. And it was utterly false because we found out after the presentation that Sheikh al-Libi, the high-level al-Qaeda operative, had been waterboarded multiple times and other things in Egypt with no U.S. personnel present, that a week or two after he had been interrogated, he recanted, saying essentially he would have done anything to stop the torture, and the DIA put out a burn notice on it. When I inquired as to why we, the secretary and I, hadn't been shown that burn notice by the DIA at the time we were preparing, I was told it was a computer glitch. Yeah, right, computer glitch. That the secretary had said, if there's any dissenting information on any of these major points, I want to see it. Well, we didn't see that dissenting information because I think they didn't want us to see it. But 99% certainty in my mind that John McLaughlin and two of the analysts who were put before Powell time and time and time again were on the vice president's payroll, so to speak. I'll add one thing too. I still think we are missing one of the major motivations for Richard Cheney and what we did in Iraq. It explains to me why in 1991 he was adamantly opposed to going to Baghdad, rightfully so.
Do you think that the U.S. or UN forces should have moved into Baghdad?
No.
Why not?
Because if we'd gone to Baghdad, we would have been all alone. There wouldn't have been anybody else with us. It would have been a U.S. occupation of Iraq. None of the Arab forces that were willing to fight with us in Kuwait were willing to invade Iraq. Once you got to Iraq and took it over and took down Saddam Hussein's government, then what are you going to put in its place? That's a very volatile part of the world, and if you take down the central government in Iraq, you can easily end up seeing pieces of Iraq fly off. Part of it the Syrians would like to have to the west. Part of eastern Iraq the Iranians would like to claim, fought over for 8 years. In the north, you've got the Kurds, and if the Kurds spin loose and join with the Kurds in Turkey, then you've threatened the territorial integrity of Turkey. It's a quagmire. And the question for the president, in terms of whether or not we went on to Baghdad and took additional casualties in an effort to get Saddam Hussein, was how many additional dead Americans is Saddam worth? And our judgment was not very many, and I think we got it right.
He changed his mind because of the Energy Task Force that he chaired, that we still don't know the transcript of, we don't know the conclusions of. They declared it executive privilege, and we don't even know what they did. But these were the heads of the major oil companies in the world. These were some of the ministers of some of the nations that own much of the oil, like Saudi Arabia, for example. I think what we went to Iraq for was not what we said we went to Iraq for, democracy, freedom, tyrant, all that. We went for the same reason we had been going from time to time since FDR met with the Saudi king and since Jimmy Carter in particular declared it a vital national interest of the United States. We went for oil. And people say, well, ExxonMobil and Chevron, they didn't get a lot of that oil. Well, bullshit. We didn't go to give the private companies access to the oil. If that was a fallout, fine, that's great. We went to make sure of what we had as a strategic objective for 30 plus years. That oil would be reasonably available to all of our allies and friends, including ourselves, that it would be at a reasonable price, and it would be consistently available. That's why we went, and we achieved that objective. Look at it today. The world's glutted with oil today.
What do you suppose would have happened if they had said, we want to go to war in Iraq, talked about things like oil, and not scared us with these stories about it?
I don't think you'd had the Congress, and I don't think you'd had the American people. Now, you could have still gone to war, but I think it probably would have meant a one term for George W. Bush.
What does that mean he kept the country safe after 9/11? In other words, we had this major catastrophe, and after that, what does that mean? I don't know. See, I've heard that for years. You know what? I've heard that for years, Jeremy. I've heard for years he kept the country safe after 9/11. What does that mean after? What about during 9/11? I was there. I lost a lot of friends that were killed in that building.
I agree with the candidate, Trump, that the Bush administration was, at least in part, lax in its preparations for and defense against what George Tenet was telling them was probably the #1 threat to the United States, and that was al-Qaeda. I think he's seen a vulnerability in the establishment Republican Party, and he's attacking that vulnerability. And it just so happens that in this case, unlike some of his other assertions, he's spot on correct. George W. Bush and Richard Cheney were delinquent in looking at the intelligence and ascertaining how serious bin Laden was about attacking the United States and putting up every possible defense against that, to include telling the FAA to put out the word to airlines and others in the travel business. It had been talked about. It had been brought up in the councils of government. Dick Clark had brought it up. George Tenet had brought it up, and yet nothing was done. Part of the shock of 9/11 on the part of the White House was that they thought, I think, in their heart of hearts, from Dr. Rice to Dick Cheney to George W. Bush, that their hold on power was perilously fraught with problems. That is to say, they might be impeached. And that's one reason why you get George W. Bush in front of a cabinet meeting saying this was an act of war. That was a tremendous change from the previous administrations all the way back to Ronald Reagan, where they were criminals and we used law enforcement to go after them. Now we're going to open the floodgates and honoring them, the criminals, we're honoring them by saying they're warriors. They're the equivalent of warriors. We had to quickly walk that back and call them illegal combatants and everything else, and abandon Geneva to deal with them and so forth, to lower them even further. But basically what we were doing was offsetting the incredible defeat we had just suffered under the leadership of George W. Bush and Richard Cheney.